Welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast. If you are passionate about helping young people to unleash their potential and want to find ways to do that better, then you've come to the right place. The Talent Equation Podcast seeks to answer the important questions facing parents, coaches, and talent developers as they try to help young people become the best they can be. This is a series of unscripted, unpolished conversations between people at the razor's edge of the talent community who are prepared to share their knowledge, experiences, and challenges in an effort to help others get better faster. Listen, reflect, and don't forget to join the discussion at thetalentequation.co.uk. Enjoy the show.
Delighted to be able to welcome back to the show. Long time since we last had a conversation. You were one of my early guests, James. James Vaughan's here. Welcome, James.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back.
And we were just discussing before we started recording that you've probably part of the reason that we haven't probably connected as much as that you've been busy trying to juggle a hectic life, coaching, bringing about cultural change within a professional sports context, and writing and researching for a PhD thesis, which I think you're now towards the back end of, and means that you can come up for air and have a conversation with me.
That's exactly right. And I've been looking forward to be able to do this as well. So, yeah, it's good. I feel lighter.
I feel lighter, mentally lighter.
Yeah.
So I guess as a kickoff, a quick resume, a quick recap on. I mean, people can listen back to the original podcast we did. That'll give them the backstory. But a little bit of a recap on kind of what's happened since. I suppose there's been a lot going on over at AIK. So yeah, just give us the quick catch up.
Okay, so since we last spoke, we had an interesting situation at the end of last year, I believe, whereby we had some information coming out of my research, some information coming out of Mark's research, some reflections from our then head of development or head of player development, and also some research that we'd done with My Fastest Mile that was all pointing in a similar direction. So we had this kind of nice moment whereby these different lenses at play, kind of viewing a similar environment, and they kind of started shining a light on one particular area for improvement, shall we say. Yeah. So a big part of that is around players' experience of autonomy and providing more autonomy support, and especially in probably in the slightly older age groups. So Mark's been doing a fantastic job along with a lot of other people, especially some really great parent coaches in the 8 to 12 space. Mm-hmm. So we can see there's, you can see online with the videos that Mark shared, there's, as we call it, kind of an evolving form of life at bottom end of the club.
Yeah.
Really good. And then as we move up through the older age groups, we kind of bump up against some older practice and some newer ideas. And what we experienced and what we found in some of that research was that perhaps the club is experienced as a little bit more controlling at times. For some people, and therefore how in the year that we've just been working with, how do we work with coaches mainly to be more autonomy supportive. So one of the things we've done recently is have Stephen Rolnick over, who's got a background in motivational interviewing and has recently turned his attention to sports coaching. And for me, one of the ways to summarize his work is to kind of call it, it's like self-determination theory in one-on-one.
Yep.
So it's really, how do we converse in a way, and how do we facilitate groups in a way that really provide those feelings of autonomy, competence, and relatedness, and how do we help create a space whereby players feel comfortable to say what they really think and feel. Yep. So like many coaches, we've bumped up against the problem of asking questions and hearing just what players kind of think they want us to hear. So we've been working in that space, and that's really what's been happening, at least in my role, which is kind of at least starts in the academy and then looks to ripple out to the wider club. That's kind of where we've been. And I've had the privilege of being with our under 14s this year, so on the grass regularly with them, and they're fantastic head coach as well. So that's been a lot of fun. So we've got to play against, we're playing some really interesting tournaments. We got to play against Barcelona earlier on in the year, which was really nice, and kind of it's an interesting test of some of the theory and some of the practice in a way, because can be quite an anxiety-provoking experience to be out against a big team in front of a home crowd, and we put processes in place to work with the players to help them communicate better and have a sense of autonomy. And I think at the same time, if you can foster that self-determination and a focus on mastery rather than just the outcome and an ego focus, then moving into higher pressure situations, I think that focus kind of sees you through. So I think we saw some of that, especially in the opening exchanges of that game, whereby we kind of came out really well. So yeah, I mean, it's a rambling update. Please stop me when it's no longer relevant.
No. It's all good, because in many ways, I suppose it's very reflective of how it is. It's very much a kind of very dynamic and ever-changing environment, and you are, I guess, pushing the boundaries. You're breaking new ground, to use all these well-used phrases. You're leading some cultural change, or you're at the very least at the heart of or part of a process of cultural change. And so, one of the things about that is it can feel very kind of, I suppose, fluid and chaotic and challenging. I just want to sort of pick up on a few things, I suppose, just to catch everybody up as well, in case they haven't picked up on the previous conversation. James is working within AIK Stockholm, which is, I'd say it's certainly one of the leading professional clubs in Sweden. It's, probably I don't want to equate it to a Premiership club, because immediately that means that you probably label it with some baggage, and then some people will not like it. But it's one of the leading professional clubs in Sweden, and you guys, in fact, you're not you guys, but the club itself made a decision aligned to some other things that were happening within the wider Swedish football landscape, but also within Swedish sport in full stop. And we share a good friend in Peter Mattsson, who heads up the Swedish Sports Confederation, and leading and driving some of that stuff around the idea of, can we reconceptualize the sports experience? So what you've essentially, for young people, what you've essentially done in the club environment is to say, what does that mean for us? What does that mean? What does that mean for us to do in order to be able to provide an experience for young people that is more akin to what they're looking to do? You have in your academy a number of fantastic thinkers, individuals who are researching, and you've got live research going on. So Mark O'Sullivan's there, and if anybody doesn't know who Mark O'Sullivan is, then I'll be amazed. But however, he's a good friend of a good friend of this show, and you can catch him on Footblog Ball, where he actually more or less shares his field notes on a pretty frequent basis, so that you can literally follow the journey that he's on with young people. Dennis Hortine is there as well, and both of those have been on the show on a previous episode and explain more about what this project is all about. Now, one of the things that's interesting about all of this is that, you've made some fairly radical moves, but one of the things you've also done is you've commissioned an external agency in the shape of this agency called My Fastest Mile, which is headed up by Al Smith with the support of a guy called John O'Byrne and also Mark Upton, who many people will know. He's been on the show before as well. And they are essentially, they're not embedded because they're not there all the time, but they are embedded in the sense that they're utilizing an almost what I would describe as an autoethnographic methodology that enables you guys to essentially track progress from the perspective of the stakeholders' eyes, I guess. And what that's doing is it's almost allowing you to take regular tests. It's a little bit like a kind of almost like a dipstick in an engine. What's the oil looking like at the moment? What's the depth? And you're able to sort of check in with the culture within your environment and compare it with where you perhaps think you are. So you're sort of saying, oh, we've got this kind of environment and culture that's a little bit. Well, actually, really, the only way you can know that is to see that through the lens of the people who are on the receiving end, be they parent, athlete, coach, in terms of what their experience is like. And you're then able to use that as to pinpoint areas of focus. And you're using and it's a unique approach that they're taking with My Fastest Mile, because it's comparing you're getting some quantifiable data, you're getting some numerics combined with some really high quality qualitative data that tells you more about the experiences that people have, and then that helps you to navigate and adjust as you go, because rarely does anybody get this right first time. So it's almost very much an iterative approach to cultural change, very akin to the idea that we have in coaching, which is an iterative approach to utilization of different constraints in order to bring about changes in groups or organisms. Anyway, you've been nodding furiously. I'll stop banging on about it, but I was keen to get your reflections on whether I've got that right, or if there are any bits that probably need further exploration or explanation.
No, that's it's a very, very good summary. It's probably better than I could have managed. And that actually is part of the beauty of having the guys from My Fastest Mile with us, is providing a zoomed out perspective. And so one of the things that they've been able to do with different senior leaders is to be there as a critical friend as well.
Yeah.
So as well as the process that you described, they're also able to be there as a sounding board, and is really helping us to stay aligned to what is really meaningful, and make sure we attend to that and have the most often difficult but yet meaningful discussions in the club as well. So that's certainly something that we're extremely grateful to have. And I think the ideas around the approach to coaching being the same approach to cultural change is pretty much spot on as well. It's slightly different, obviously, but the fundamentals are there. So the ideas around a constraints-led approach in particular, for us, ecological dynamics, which Mark and I are always trying to push outside of just the realm of sport and push it into the cultural realm a little bit more by talking about sociocultural constraints. And really, Dennis has done a fantastic job at a more of a senior leadership role in terms of probing at different times and finding the right opportunities to move, if we're going to use this language, the system in a different direction. So where we've been is that the 8s to 12s was a real focus, and implementing the ideas of nonlinear pedagogy and Mark's influence mentoring that space, and Dennis's influence with bringing in particular coaches to work in that space, and then all of that kind of happening together has created what at the moment seems to be a really healthy little environment at that end of the club. And that radiates out as well. So there's influences that go beyond the club and go up and through the club and out to other clubs, which is really nice. And now Dennis is strategically turning his attention to the slightly older age groups, so 13 to 15. So this is the challenge point in many ways, because the club made the decision not to select players below the age of 12, to leave them kind of ensure that there's some sort of childhood there whereby they don't start specializing for a sport too early and then be wrapped up in all the anxiety of performance and comparison that comes with that. So now in the 13 to 15 space, there's a question to ask, and that question is, do you want to specialize? And that's a question that is then asked of the players, and we hope that at that age the players are old enough to really consider that question carefully on what it means. Now, for different players in different stages of development, they'll consider it more or they consider it less. And they're still going to be influenced by their parents and their peers. But we hope now there's the possibility that it becomes more of a self-determined decision. And then from there, we will have a group of players that say, yes, I would like to specialise. And we have a group of players that say, no, I'm actually just quite happy playing football the way it is. Mm-hmm. So to go back to originally kind of talking about AIK in comparison to a Premier League club, the really interesting thing here is it is both the academy side of things and it's a grassroots club as well. And what we're attempting to do now, the change that Dennis is leading with the other senior leaders in the club, is to integrate that horizontally, if that makes sense. Yeah. So to stop thinking about different silos of boys club, girls club, boys academy, girls academy, like they're all learners. Yeah. And therefore, the coaches and the way they work can be, we can get a lot of benefit by working together and in an integrated way. So the interesting challenge point now is talking to the players of those age groups and asking, well, who wants to specialize and who doesn't want to specialize, and then from there being flexible around what that means, and having a team that will end up as an academy team and a team that will end up as a motivation team. And the goal long term is to be able to resource both of those teams in the same way.
Do you, if someone decides that they're not ready to specialise, I assume that doesn't mean that the door is closed.
Not at all.
Yeah, so it's still a revolving door. And if at any point they say that they're ready, then they can. But I suppose there's some opportunity cost there, isn't there? Because I suppose if they specialise, it therefore means that their training volume can go up because they're not having to essentially trade time that they would otherwise use in other sports contexts. And so I suppose the fear they would have, albeit I wouldn't say this should be a real fear, but I can understand why it would be a real fear, that they or their parents would have is, I'm going to miss out because I'm not going to be doing the same training volume as others. And so that must be quite difficult to manage, I imagine.
We will find out.
Yeah, because this is still a relatively new area, isn't it?
This is completely new. Look, and as you said before, it's an iterative approach to kind of culture change. So yeah, we'll be responsive and we'll see what happens. I mean, Dennis is very good at keeping the bigger picture in view and looking at this as leadership of a complex adaptive system, and therefore you can only probe, sense, respond. So this is a probe, and we're going to have to, as you said before, take the temperature or use a dipstick to find out what happens, and then we'll respond accordingly. But we'd like to move things in the right direction. And as I referenced at the start, autonomy supportive being, a bit of a guiding light for the direction that we'd like to move in.
It's interesting. I had a very interesting conversation yesterday. I was with one of the governing bodies who had a day that was looking into some changes it wanted to make within its coach education system, and we were having a conversation around kind of more, I guess, autonomous or humanistic approaches. People talk about kind of learner-centeredness versus, I guess, organization-centered or tutor-centered or whatever it might be, and trying to alternative approaches. And I was having a conversation with Chris Cushion, Professor Chris Cushion, who's researched heavily in coach education space, and I don't mind admitting we have clashed or crossed swords in the past in a good-natured way, but definitely some robust debate. We were on the same group yesterday, and we had a really fascinating conversation. And as with all these things, once we got face to face, we discovered we really actually agreed on an awful lot of stuff. But we're having a really interesting discussion about power, and he really, as he should, is a very learned man. Very, very, really opened my eyes to a few things, and it was a really interesting conversation, particularly around this idea of how often what you might call humanistic approaches or approaches that seek to provide or seek to have more autonomy within them, i.e., much more choice, aren't actually providing choice, because there's an implied right answer, or whether that implicit right answer is a real one or a perceived one, it's still there. And so this idea of power and giving power over is a little bit of a false idea. The power is there. It's just being aware of that constantly to ensure that it's not coercive, if you like. So it's almost like false choice. Oh, it's your choice whether you want to specialize or not. But it's a false choice, because really deep down inside, everybody knows that if you make that choice, you're kind of saying, I don't want to progress any further in this particular activity. I know it's not that. And I know you're certainly trying to avoid that. But it was just an interesting dynamic that kind of came into my head, and I'd just be interested to get your thoughts on.
Well, in my master's, I spent a lot of time looking at self-determination theory, and Cliff Mallet, my supervisor there, is very big and knowledgeable in the space. Mm-hmm. And he'd talk a lot about problematizing, like the idea of providing basic psychological needs support. And autonomy is a really interesting one in there, because the other thing is these things don't happen in isolation. So autonomy intersects with relatedness and also competence. So I think one of the ways I make sense of what you're saying is that, for example, if you're asked a question and you don't feel competent enough to give an answer, well, that's not providing autonomy. That's almost like that's creating some sort of paralysis. Mm-hmm. So, and then if you're not in an environment where there's sufficient amount of relatedness, you might feel like, well, Jesus, I'm not answering this question in front of this group of people that I don't belong to or feel any sort of relation towards. So for me, that's like the doctor, you're in the meeting with the doctor and you've got a problem, and the doctor's going, Stu, we can do A, B, or C. Mm-hmm. What do you want to do? That's actually, I think that's happened in cases. Yeah, and this is supposedly providing autonomy, and you're going, whoa, doc, you're the expert. You went to medical school for 10 years. Just you make the decision, man. This is not me. It's not on me. No, Stu, what do you want to do? That's not given autonomy. It's crazy. So we have to recognize that the autonomy and structure, and again, to go back, that's a complex dynamic. So sometimes there needs to be structure to the choice to allow people to feel competent in making the decision and having the choice. Yeah. And then autonomy is more than just choice as well. It's self-expression, which comes from the values that are embedded in your culture and what you've internalized. So there's loads and loads to dig into, even around that one idea. And the point around the power dynamic in general is also extremely relevant.
Because, one of the things that Chris, it was a really good quote, actually, not a quote, but it's a line from, I think it was Robin Jones coined it, the idea of being in authority or an authority. Mm. And I think quite a big difference between the two. And what you guys are doing, I think, is to move away from being in authority, but recognizing that you are, whether you like it or not. You're responsible, you have a duty of care, which means you're in authority. You're also an authority in the sense that you have knowledge. And so you're able to inform the choice, or at the very least, help the individual to come to a decision that they feel they're going to be comfortable with. Now, it's interesting in a coaching context, from the perspective of coach education. It's interesting because there is this sort of sense, and it's the same when it comes to coaching and coaching athletes. There's this sense around the self-determination that that we're creating environments, and there's freedom of expression and creativity, and you can go in a whole range of different ways, and you can choose your. But I wonder if in reality, a lot of people are presenting false choice to the athlete or the coach, because, and I was sort of saying this, that in a coaching course, where there is a competence assessment at the end of it, you really, it's very, very difficult in that environment to say to somebody, there's a range of different ways of you doing this. Really, what you need to do is to discover the way that's working for you, and to have an appropriate rationalization using research to be able to kind of make the justification for that course of action and all those sorts of things. But in reality, everybody knows that there is a right answer at the end. So it's coercive. And likewise in a coaching context, I think a lot of that happens as well, where coaches are saying, yeah, it's about freedom of choice, but ultimately when it comes down to it, you've got to do this and do that, otherwise I'm not picking you in the team.
Well, there's that, and there's also going into a Q&A moment and going in with the answer that you'd like to hear, or a couple of answers you'd like to hear in the back, versus going in without. Because how genuine is the question when you already have the answers that you want to hear in the back of your mind? And let's not pretend to ourselves that the players aren't going to see through that. So can we genuinely ask the question and be curious about the answers? Or, as you say, is there an element of cohesion there in terms of the way, we already have the answer, but this questioning thing is good because it's going to support these kids' problem solving. So, which actually leads me back to something you mentioned in a brief, when we messaged back and forth around the idea that session design can probably provide that space, that autonomy, that problem solving space as much. And I've been battling with the ideas of, well, how much Q&A and when is it appropriate versus when is just manipulating constraints, or when is going in and talking appropriate. And that mixes in with the ideas of, knowledge in the game versus knowledge about the game. So we're in a space at the moment whereby there's loads of different ideas and theories being that we can draw upon, but they don't have a shared foundation. If that makes sense. So it's kind of difficult to piece them together, which is one of the arguments that I was trying to make in a paper I managed to get published recently. So if you're starting a process from a transdisciplinary perspective, you pay attention to the bigger picture. And when you develop puzzle pieces of knowledge, you make sure that they can fit together. And they fit together in relation to the bigger picture. Whereas I think previously what's happened with science in its disciplinary or monodisciplinary form is that we're creating these puzzle pieces all over the place. But no one's attending to whether they fit together, and no one's attending to the bigger picture as well.
Yeah, you're right. So if I understand what you're saying correctly, let me just check my understanding. What you're saying is, when you talk about transdisciplinary, I assume you mean theologies.
Sorry, say again?
When you talk about transdisciplinary, I assume you mean the ologies, i.e., your physiologist and your psychologist and your physiotherapist and your strength and conditioning people all coming together with their bit of the jigsaw, but no one fitting it together. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. And so when we get to this space where we're talking about the power and the self-determination theory and ideas of questioning versus manipulating constraints, we're kind of throwing all these different pieces of a puzzle into the middle here, and then we're trying to fit them together. But there's no bigger picture because they come from in many ways, different worldviews. Yeah. So there's a different, to use big words that we don't, worldview, but different ontologies, epistemologies. And therefore we struggle in this space. And I feel coaches are in this space as much as anyone else, and maybe more than anyone else, because we're drawing from ideas of learning that come from a classroom or that come from laboratories, or now we're realizing, well, really it needs to be representative to what's going on the pitch. But then psychology is having a say, sometimes neuroscience is having a say, sometimes another discipline is having a say, strength and conditioning is having a lot of say. So we're pulled from pillar to post.
Yeah.
And then it almost becomes a shouting match between the disciplines about who gets listened to and who informs practice.
Yeah. And often the voice that's loudest in that dynamic is the voice with the most perceived validity. So the hard sciences usually.
Exactly. And to reference many conversations that I have with coaches across different sports, then it comes down to kilometers run and sprints made. And that being a defining metric for how we're then going to go and coach the next session that we go and do.
No one's more powerful within the professional sports context than the analyst these days.
Yeah, it seems to be that way, right? It seems to be.
Information is power. I mean, I'm being really facetious because I actually think that there's loads of people in the analytics community who've got an absolutely fantastic contribution to make, and many are, I actually think, looking at. Well, I know many of them are looking at the use of analytics around the idea of actually how can they begin to more accurately measure performance from the perspective of skill development, skill acquisition, those sorts of things, more, to ensure that practice environments are as representative as possible and therefore as impactful as possible, more than they're just saying you did this number of passes and this number of kicks and this, that and the other, therefore you are a good player versus you are not a good player.
Yeah, totally. Sometimes I've been trying to think of a good way to explain or even for myself to kind of encapsulate these ideas. And I think it's kind of like you're driving a car and you forgot to take your reading glasses off. So what becomes in focus is the dashboard. So you got the speedo, which is your sprints, and you've got your fuel tank, which is your kilometers run, really in focus. So you're driving along, and those are the things that you can see. So obviously that's the information that you attend to and you make your decisions around. And then if you build an idea of how I drive my car and I get from A to B, well, you use that information to do that because that's what you have in focus.
Yep.
Now, for me, we've got stuck with our reading glasses on, and we've got better and better, and we've made better and better reading glasses so we can focus in more and more, so we can zoom in. And because we've had so much success wearing our reading glasses and zooming in, we've kind of forgotten that, hang on, there are other lenses here that could be appropriate and could be useful and could be more appropriate. Because I'm not saying that zooming in, I'm not saying the traditional way of doing science is bad. But if we get stuck in that zoomed in lens, we miss so much. So in the driving analogy, you can't see the cars coming, the road signs, you can't see where to go. And so we miss important information.
Totally. And that's, funnily enough, you were talking about the kind of, I guess, the things that get poured into the bucket. and coming at it from a slightly different worldview. That's kind of one of the challenges we face. And I think the glasses analogy is quite a good one, in the sense that the problem you often have with the different disciplines is you can only look at them when you're wearing a certain lens, certain type of glasses. So you have to take the glasses off to put the other glasses on to be able to see where they've got to. And I think where coaches often find themselves having a sort of in the middle of this kind of soup, this this multidisciplinary soup, is they have to be very vocal. They have to wear varifocals. Now the problem with varifocals is you don't necessarily see as clearly as anybody who's got the proper glasses on, but you can see enough. Yeah. And so you have to get used to the idea of making decisions iteratively often, and usually you do it iteratively, making decisions based on imperfect information, because the complexity of human development, particularly in dynamic contexts, is such that you can't afford to do anything else, because otherwise you make catastrophic errors and then you have to do an awful lot of working backwards, which is how most people do things. And the problem is with the catastrophic errors in a professional context is they're usually pretty costly. In terms of the human side. So one of the things that I describe it as is like your point about driving in with the glasses, is I think about it a little bit similar, but it's like riding a bike in fog. There might be a open manhole right in front of us that we can't see, or a few yards in front of us that we can't see. When we get there, we'll work out a way to go around it. So in order to get so what we need to do then is to be happier with the idea of the speed at which we're going to go. If we go too fast, we're falling in that manhole. Right? So we have to go slower than we probably want to go, because people want things done quickly. They want to see progress fast. So you go slower on the basis that you don't have a catastrophe, and then you can navigate the problems as you go, because when you swerve that manhole, you might then find that there's a lamppost in front of you, and you've then got to make another swerve, and this, that, and the other. So you have to go at the right speed, because the fog isn't getting out of the way. And people go, oh, well, if we just get high quality information and we really drill in to our ologies and we get a full picture, we'll have complete clarity and we'll be able to move forward. But that'll never happen, ever. So you just have to get used to operating in the fog.
The more you drill in, the more you limit your view.
Yeah,
is my take on that. So I think that's a big challenge in itself. And I think is it the vari lenses? Is that what you?
Varifocal.
Varifocal. So being able to zoom in and zoom out, essentially, and focus on different depths. Yeah. That's where I think we need to go. This is the promise for me of transdisciplinarity. When you, rather than throwing everything into the soup and trying to navigate all these different ologies, if you can start from a basis and go, well, we actually share the same worldview, and the world is complex and dynamic, and we can view it as nested, complex, adaptive systems. And we can understand culture at that level, then we can understand organizations at that level, then we can understand pedagogy at that level and sport at that level. And we're starting to have that now. So that's my argument, because at the broadest level, you've got dynamic systems theory. And then as you come in from that to apply that to sport, you have ecological dynamics. And as you come into that, you zoom in again, you've got then nonlinear pedagogy, and then zoom in again, and you've got constraints-led approach. And then in this space, and it's something that I need to dig into myself, you've even got then ways of viewing movement through that lens that then zoom in and out. So the Skilled Intentionality Framework is one that zooms out to appreciate the form of life. But then we'll also zoom in to appreciate the relevant field of affordances. So these ideas are coming, and the philosophies, if you like, because I think that's like the Skilled Intentionality Framework is in that area, although it's backed up by a lot of decent evidence in this area as well. are coming, and then from there we have an opportunity to play with these new ideas and see if they're a better fit. But one of my kind of arguments in the paper was just that, like, and in a way it's a struggle to admit this, because it's also suggesting that our way of viewing the world is the right way. Mm-hmm. But I think what I'm suggesting is that the complex adaptive systems view of the world is a way that allows us to work across that spectrum and zoom in at different levels and make sure we create puzzle pieces that fit together, and we have a broader picture that we can all agree on. So if we come together as disciplines, but we have that shared understanding and that shared worldview, then those pieces hopefully are going to fit together, and the practices that emerge as we co-create knowledge in this way also are going to be relevant to context, because that's one of the key principles for taking a transdisciplinary approach as well, is being extremely sensitive to the cultural context and those dynamics.
Right. Lots in there, and I'm going to pick some of those jigsaw pieces apart with you in a minute, because there's a few people I know might be listening to this going, what's that? So we'll come back to a few. I've made a note of them as we were going, but let's just talk about these different worldviews for a kickoff. And I think one of the reasons these things, where this stems from. So what's really interesting for me is, I feel like the world is shifting a little. I hear far more, and certainly in the role or the world of sports policy, which I inhabit from time to time, is shifting in that direction too, and has shifted in that direction, much more towards certainly a kind of complex, kind of dynamical systems approach to thinking about wicked problems, that, like, how do you bring about a change to a population level change to physical activity levels from the perspective of well-being, health, social cohesion, individual development and thriving, and ultimately also economic development. How do you do that? And traditionally, the approach has been zoom in, learn something, zoom back out again, develop a nationwide intervention, apply intervention across everybody, job is done. I think what we've discovered, what policymakers have discovered, is that has limited effect. It doesn't have the effect that it should have on the population level. It has some effect, but not the effect it could have with the resources that are available. Therefore, with the limited resources that are available, and they're always limited, resources are always limited, but with the limited resources, what is a more effective approach? So the kind of zoom in, zoom out policy level intervention is an efficient way of doing things, but it isn't particularly effective. And I think it was Peter Drucker who said, efficiency is doing things right. Effectiveness is doing the right things, or the other way around. I can never quite remember. Anyway, so the recognition now is we need to go for things that are effective rather than efficient, which might mean that we have to do less things, and we have to do them slower. We have to do them over a longer period of time, but we do them in a way that brings meaningful, genuinely sustainable, community-led, from the ground up, developmental activities that become part of the fabric of life in that locality. And that's very much kind of an approach that's being very much driven now. And so it's quite exciting. It's quite exciting to hear this kind of language, when we've been having these sorts of conversations for a number of years, and when you view the world in that way. Now, the other way of seeing things, I think that has been, the dominant paradigm has been almost to break things into their component parts. reductionism and go, what we do is we understand the world by virtue of their component parts. We reassemble them at some stage, and then once they're reassembled, we have a whole, and the whole can be what it is. The whole will only ever be what it is. It will only ever be the sum of its parts. And what I guess the ecological or the dynamical systems approach sort of suggests is, actually, if you work in a different way, which is, let's just take the whole and working in appreciating complexity and working almost from the bottom up, but not in its component parts, the whole could be more than the sum of the parts, way more than the sum of the parts, and hence is where you get this effectiveness approach, which is quite an interesting way of looking at the world. And I think the reason those worldviews have differed is often in the multidisciplinary approach, the starting point for particularly, let's say, the hard sciences has been a scientific approach based on isolate down, reduce down, take a very small thing, find out a lot about it. Right, we know that now. Where does that connect with something else? Where does that connect with something else? What we find there is that those types of disciplines tend to want to be very, very focused in their lane, very siloed, very in their lane. They don't lend themselves naturally to connectivity with other ologies. They just don't, because of the nature in which you actually go through the process of learning. Whereas if you start and say, right, let's just start here. Right, here's an individual or a group of individuals. What do we know about them? And then what does that mean for everybody else in terms of their expertise, so that we can create an environment, which is exactly what you're doing in AIK. What does everything you guys know mean for our form of life? And then what can you add to help that form of life nurture, grow, flourish? Very different way of thinking. And I imagine quite challenging for some of the people who you've got who are specialists to almost despecialize a little in order to be able to contribute.
Certainly. So there's loads buzzing around my head there. And one of the general ideas that we've touched on is around the difference between being a specialist and a generalist.
Yes.
What you touched on before as well is the idea of starting with the inquiry, not starting with a discipline. It's very different.
Yeah.
Don't start with a discipline and do your research because you are a ologist.
Yeah.
Start with this is the wicked problem and recognize it as that, and then how can we bring to light the important things here? How can we understand them first, and then where do we go? And then your point around reductionism, which is spot on, has also been explained to me in that what it's done is break down the relations between different components and break down the world so that these relations are broken. Whereas a dynamic systems approach is more about understanding the relations between things. So rather than isolating the thing, it's the relation between the thing and the interaction between the thing that's important, which when you then scale that down to the football pitch, which is why Mark talks about football interactions and not isolated actions.
Yeah.
So trying to embed that worldview and the language that relates to it throughout the process from on the grass and as wide as possible is important. The thing that came to mind when you were kind of discussing the zooming in and then zooming out to policy level, it's a little bit like if we had a broad helicopter view of a football pitch, and there's so much going on. There's 22 players, there's 20,000 fans. It's within a cultural context. There's the state of the game. There's the time. There's the state in the league for that year. So much to consider, and yet what happens is we zoom in on one player, we zoom in on their leg, we zoom in on their hamstring, and then we might learn something there, and then that's going to try and be used to determine a wider program of practice for then how we develop football players. And in that moment, you've disregarded so much information, and I'm not saying it's that exact. I'm taking it to the extreme to make the point. But for me, that's a little bit of an example of where things can go wrong. So if you just learn about the hamstring and what's going on in a football game and how fatigue over 90 minutes affects it, and then you build a program of practice for football players, whereby that's the dominant bit of information, well, you're going to struggle. And as we've said before, now we're getting all these different bits of information thrown at us. It's very difficult to bring them together. The policy level discussion also reminded me of the Cobra Effect. Have you heard of that?
Go on.
Well, it's actually one of Dennis's favorite stories, so I've got to credit him with it. But the Cobra Effect happened in India. It's when the time of the British colonies, and the British decided that, you know what, there's too many bloody cobras all over the place. These snakes are a hazard. So what we're going to do is we've seen the locals can deal with them, so we're going to pay the locals for every cobra head that they bring us. So what did the locals start doing? They started farming cobras.
That's a great story.
So then the British find out about this and they go, well, hang on a minute, this is ridiculous. We're not going to pay you any more for the heads of cobras if you're farming them. So what did they do? They released all the cobras.
That is a brilliant story that absolutely illustrates so much about policy.
Well, and that's Dennis's favourite. So,
unintended consequences. People game the system.
Yeah.
Whereas the alternative approach from a complex study is what you do is you agree mutually beneficial boundaries. It's not a free-for-all. You know, some people, I think where people go wrong in the kind of complexity approach, if you like, which is the viewpoint which is where the ecological dynamics kind of nests itself, which is the idea that, you know, it's not a pre-prescribed set of rules that you have to adhere to, you know, from a performer's perspective that then makes you into a sports performer. There is a very flexible approach to solving the game problems, right? So, but there are boundaries. You know, it's not a complete free-for-all. You don't just say, oh, do what you like. Yeah, go on. Just play. That's not what it's about at all. It's about agreed boundaries and frameworks that allow for genuine exploration, focused and intense, sometimes exploration. It can be very focused down into a very, almost like a very small thing, but it's because we've kind of agreed that that's where we're going to focus on. And the boundaries are created as such, and they're flexible. They can flex. We can go outside of them if we want to. You know, you can jump over the fence if you need to, if that's where we all agree we need to go. But in principle, what we're doing is we're saying, you know, we're going to stay in this. I use an analogy a lot of. People often think it's just like being in the wilderness. Where the hell are we going? You know, oh God, we're in the jungle. Oh God, we don't. Oh well, you know, okay, we'll go this direction. Fine, we'll go in that direction. It can be like that. It can be, because sometimes as a coach, you don't know. You don't know the right course of action. So actually you are in the wilderness together, and the only thing that you've got to rely on is each other's intuition and knowledge, their knowledge of doing, our knowledge of knowing, and our knowledge of doing as well, that helps us iterate through that process. So we just take small steps as we move. But in other cases, we've actually established some fairly safe boundaries. So it's not really like a complete jungle or a wilderness. It's more like a meadow or a kind of a country park. You know, if you fall over and break your leg, someone will come and save you. You're not completely out in the middle of nowhere. So it's a safer space to operate within. And that's kind of the environment that we're trying to create, in my view. But I think people make the misunderstanding because people think the opposite of a structured, ordered approach is free-for-all. No. You don't have to go to free-for-all. There's a lot of space in between.
Well, this is a really valid point, and it brings me actually to something I had noted down here. So people, that's thinking in dichotomies.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it seems like we have a bit of a history of this in the West. From my limited digging into Western philosophy, but I mean dichotomies between mind and body, between social and material. There are many others out there as well. I'm sure people can fill in the blanks as we go. And what I find interesting at the moment in and around all of this, so much of the ecological worldview or the complex adaptive systems worldview, when you get down to, well, how do we work in this space? Well, there's the concept of system intentionality. And when you're then talking about people, well, that's a lot about setting intentions. But that's different from setting goals. And when I hear about that language and I read about the science, and then I kind of couple that to other things, I'm going, well, that sounds very Eastern in philosophy. That to me sounds like meditation, setting an intention, and recognizing that it's not a hard goal, or it's not a procedure to follow, but there's an intention there. And this practice, whatever it is going to kind of be anchored to that intention, but we see where it goes. And what I find interesting at the moment is that we've got yoga, meditation, and particularly meditation being accepted and now embraced by Western science. And people are going, oh, this is really good and this is really helpful. And yes, it is. And that's great that science can say that. But also, Buddhism's been around for 2,000 years. And in indigenous cultures and historically, we've had that knowledge. So what else are we going to wait around for science to kind of prove before we start like changing our practice? And I'm obviously not anti-science at all, and I'm just hopefully getting a PhD, so I respect the process. But I think it's interesting to consider that our way of thinking and thinking in dichotomies and breaking things down has led us to research in certain areas and miss other areas. And only now are we coming to some of those other areas and finding that they're really useful. The other one that's hot at the moment is around psychedelics. And the benefit of that. And there's some, a resurgence of research in that area that suggests it could be extremely beneficial. And which is wonderful and great. But the interesting thing is that indigenous cultures from all around the world, from different ecologies and environments, have found ways to manipulate plants plants in really strange ways to get a psychedelic experience. Now, why have they done that? Like, it just wouldn't occur in all these different places around the world if it wasn't beneficial. I heard one the other day, Stu, whereby there's a certain mushroom that if you feed it to a horse and then the horse, the mushroom passes and the horse goes for a wee, if you drink the wee, you get a psychedelic experience. But if you just eat the mushroom without going through the horse, you hurt yourself. How did someone find that out? How did they find that out? That's crazy. But they found it out, and then it was passed down culturally to a point whereby, there's some benefit to it. So for me, it's super interesting to consider, but the Eastern philosophies are generally more holistic, generally recognize having this intention behind what you're doing rather than a fixed set goal at the end of it, and generally avoid the dichotomies that we tend to think in the West as well. So there's some interesting stuff there, and I realize I kind of thrown a curveball.
No, because in many ways it's kind of a point, which is I'd be really interested to know how much have we missed? How much have we missed in terms of what's possible in the capabilities of human beings, because we've almost become this slavish adherent to this hyper-specialized notion of, what kind of breakthroughs in medicine could we have had? And the connectivity that we now have across the world affords those kinds of medical breakthroughs like never before. But sadly, the reality is that connectivity has just almost become a force for bad, because all it's done is been used by politicians to hyperinflate negative and outrage messages and things like that, which has then led to a rise of right-wing populism. But let's not go into the politics of it. But my point being is that actually the connectivity could be valuable if people could get out of the ologies. If we could view these wicked problems. Have you read David Epstein's latest book, Range?
I haven't yet, no.
It's really resonates with a lot of this. The central thesis is hyperspecialization is actually causing a lot of difficulties, and talks a lot about, for example, there was a particular innovation group that looked at kind of almost like, kind of dealing with wicked problems or forecasting against wicked problems. And groups of non-specialists what beat hyper-specialists time and time and time again in a range of different domains, because they don't get narrowly focused into or trapped by A, only seeing the world through one lens, and B, getting, I guess, almost like the wanting to defend their perspectives.
Exactly.
And that's one of the things that I'm finding actually a lot, which is when you're talking about ecological approaches, the utilization of approaches that are, kind of, I guess, that are driven from an ecological perspective, there's a lot of opposition from a range of different sources, and it can be quite vociferous. But a lot of the opposition comes from the fact that those individuals have got two reasons for that. One is they're trying to protect a position. Now, whether that's a pedagogical position that they are, very wedded to, either emotionally, financially, or all of the above, or they're protecting or protective of a body of work that suggests something else. And in all those cases, I've noticed there's this kind of almost like inability to see. It's almost like, well, it's either this or it isn't. And what they do is they look for the cracks. So they'll go, oh, direct instruction. You just said direct instruction. Oh, that doesn't fit in an ecological worldview. Of course it does. What do you mean? No, it doesn't. That's against everything you've talked about. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. And they want everything to fall in its box. And when something that doesn't seem like it fits in the box, and so then they start to, well, it can just be anything then. It can be anything can fit in there. Yeah, it can. Yeah. It's all about where you start from, though. It's all about the lens through which you look at it through. What? What are you talking about? That's just crazy.
Well, it reminds me of, I think of the map makers back at the time of Christopher Columbus. Can you imagine all those guys that had spent, all their time mapping the world so that it's flat, and then drawing that, and then suddenly someone's going, no, it's actually round. No, it's flat. Buy my map. Whereas,
look at the map. It shows it. Yeah,
exactly. Whereas, oh, hang on a minute. No, we think it's round now. Shut up. It's not. Buy my map. My flat map. So yeah, I mean, you can see how that happens when people have spent. The first few people who suggested that the Earth was round were killed. They were killed as heretics, weren't they? Yeah. Well, yeah. Make sure you lock your door at night, Steve.
Yeah. Well, exactly. I mean, yeah. Listen. I mean, often our conversations work like this, right? You get the first half where we kind of geek out on some like philosophical conversations about the nature of reality. I suppose that's another conversation, and I'd be very interested to talk another time with you about some of the stuff around the psychedelic side. Not that I've particularly ever gone there. In fact, I've never gone there, but I'm very interested because not because of, but because I think there is some interesting. I mean, Sam Harris talks about this a lot. I don't know if you listen to his podcast. But he talks a lot about that, and he actually uses meditation, or has sought to use, following an experiment as a young person with psilocybin, I think, has then sought to use meditation or meditative practice as a means by which to find a similar state. I think there are similar states to be found in the world of sport, which Csikszentmihalyi would talk about as being, kind of flow or whatever. I've definitely, and I'm really interested in potentially getting into more detail with this at some point. I would self-report that I've experienced flow states in coaching. Not enough, thanks very much. I'd like more, but I do. Usually at the most challenging point as well, or at a point that is right at the edge of my capabilities as a coach. And they at all levels, not just at elite, but with grassroots context as well. So I've definitely achieved, got there, and maybe had fleeting moments of it. But yeah, so I'm really interested in that idea around, the kind of almost like those slightly altered states of consciousness, whether they're naturally arising or otherwise.
Well, exactly. That one, I'm trying to get through a book which I'd recommend, although I haven't got through it yet. It's been great, the start of it at least. It's called How the World Thinks, and it's a comparison between Western and Eastern philosophy, which is really how we think in the West and how we think in the East traditionally. And direct perception, not that it's called that, comes through a lot.
Really?
in different Eastern philosophies. Yeah. So that there is knowledge out there to be discovered, and it's not through rational thought. It's through this direct engagement, this direct perception with the environment, and with rational thought and the thinking mind kind of melting away, which again suggests like a flow state. It suggests like something you might experience in higher levels and states of meditation, and the psychedelic experience as well. And it's been suggested to me that the way you can get with meditation is similar to where you'd like to get with psychedelics, which one part of that is just dissolution of ego. Yeah. So your ego melts away, which comes back then to people defending their disciplinary positions. And when ego and self melts away, you realize that everyone is connected. Yeah. So there's on many levels, this is really relevant stuff. It's just, again, how far you want to zoom out away from sport and how much you want to zoom in. And one of the things around this that came to mind when you were talking about policy and the bigger picture and making interventions and wicked problems is, why are governments and policymakers not looking more broadly at the problems they face and how to address them together? Because I would suggest that the issues around sport being sustainable and health and well-being are tied, connected to issues with environment, whether that's the environment that we create from an affordance landscape in a playground, but also nature and also the degradation of the climate in general. So 100%. These massive problems have solutions that can be integrated and can work together, I believe.
100%. That's exactly what's happening, which is policy being driven from the ground up that solves these wicked problems as the problems present themselves. You can't ever imagine these problems from a national level. So a really good example, actually, is something called I'm going to call it Little Holland. It was a project called Little Holland. It's in Walthamstow in London, where the council, or whoever it was at the time, whichever policymaker it was, said, we want to encourage cycling like they do in Holland. We want more people to cycle. Well, in Walthamstow, there's a great big dual carriageway that goes right through the middle of two sides of the borough, if you like, which firstly gets in the way. But also in and around, it's a very urban environment, lots and lots of traffic challenges and all those sorts of things. So like, how do you encourage people to be able to cycle more freely? So a series of experiments conducted, iterative process, which required a entire kind of multi-agency approach. So you needed transport to be involved, you needed recreation, obviously, you needed health, and a range of different services. And so what they started to do is they started to block off roads with planting. So they'd use planting, not bollards, they'd planting and things like this, and create these spaces that cars couldn't go. Now, needless to say, there was uproar, there was protests, there were mini riots, this, that and the other, over a period of time, dealing with the challenges of people. What's happened is a new economy, a green economy, where deliveries are made to people's houses through cycle-based delivery vehicles, and people now routinely either walk or cycle to local shopping, which initially was saying we're dead now, that's the end for us, because no one's going to come here, they're all going to drive over there. What it actually did was it regrew local economy, it regrew local shopping, and now people are now making cycling journeys to local shopping, and they've got this vibrant community environment driven by human-powered transportation, as opposed to everybody immediately just default, jump in the car, go to the shopping centre.
Here's another one that's a tangent again, but there's research around the health benefits of walking and cycling, and for the brain, right?
Yep.
But because of that comes from a specific disciplinary lens, I can't say never. I haven't found any research that looks at the influence of direct perception and moving through space.
Yes.
Because for me, if we're talking about our brain, it makes a lot of sense that is going to be something that facilitates engagement. It can lead to some sort of, people enjoy walking.
Yeah.
And they enjoy riding their bike. They're moving through space. So there's a benefit to that as well, which I don't think we've truly uncovered yet, because we haven't necessarily used the right lens to look at that. But we've gone, well, exercising leads to all these health benefits, and a lot of them are cognitive. And yet they're unsure why. And I think movement through space is something that can be inherently engaging.
Yeah.
And it can lead to a flow state if done in an engaging way as well. So, that solution, which gets people walking more and biking more, it's good for the environment, it's good for people's health, and it potentially touches on mental health issues as well.
And just that idea of enabling human movement in a range of different contexts. And I do agree with you as well. I think a lot of people are, looking, for example, like walking for travel, like or cycling for travel and what's. I don't think that's the same, because there's this kind of almost got to get there. That's not the same as we're walking, and while we're walking, we're going to take in this scene, we're going to connect with this human, we're going to have this engagement over there, we're going to do these sorts of things. It's not the same. It's a slightly different experience. Now, I'm not saying it's about walking for leisure necessarily, because I still think that's also very powerful. And there is a whole Japanese, talk about Eastern philosophy, thing about nature bathing. I can't remember what the actual Japanese term is, but this idea of just being in nature. And I've got she's not quite in front of me at the moment, but I've got an 11-month-old dog, spaniel called Flo, who gets me out into nature. Probably not as often as I'd like, because I'm quite often traveling into work into the city. But that's kind of the part of the idea behind having this other little life form in the household. Is it's a way of kind of getting out into nature and playing and finding some sort of different connection with the world. So it's an interesting thing in full. As much as I'd like to carry on with that, because it's an area of particular personal interest, you did say something earlier which I promised I'd come back to, and I do want to talk about it. The Skilled Intentionality Framework. What the hell is that, someone might say to me?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, it leans on, I suppose the same sort of ideas from ecological psychology that we would use in ecological dynamics and the constraints-led approach. And it's more broad in that it's just about people moving through their lives, and how there's an element of that being about direct perception, not rational thought. Again, so it can be from the example they give in the paper is sitting in a coffee shop, and they talk about when someone finishes their cup of coffee or has a sip and they put it down. Well, if they put it down close to themselves so that it affords them to pick it back up again, it's pretty obvious that they're still drinking the cup of coffee and that the conversation that's happening will continue. Whereas as it gets time to go and jump on the train, a person might take the sip, put the coffee cup down and just push it away slightly. And so they put it out of reach. So it's no longer affords picking up and drinking in as easy a way. And the suggestion is that these little micro interactions are going on all the time, and that we can pick up on them, and that there's this like layer of intention that helps us, guides us through the world, that's not necessarily conscious all the time, but it is there. So it's again the idea of perception action, and that we're not rationalizing everything. And perhaps the easiest is to go to a football example. So in my thesis, I try and talk about this, and there's a lot to flesh out in terms of the nuance and the language and kind of walking through that. And it might be very difficult to get through that today. But what I noticed here, and we're touching on stuff we talked about in the last podcast, but if a young player in Sweden gets the ball, their intention is to go straight for the goal, and their intention is to dribble as quickly as they can and go and score the goal, right? So it's very much like that. That's it. So the affordances that are relevant to that player in that context are really open spaces to dribble, and am I close enough to shoot? Whereas in the Catalan context where I was, it was much more when I've got the ball, well, hang on a minute, the relevant affordances are that, well, yeah, I could dribble. I could shoot perhaps, but I could also pass the ball out here wide. Actually, I've got a player standing in space behind me, and we could move the ball there as well if there's too much pressure. Or if that player runs, if the defender moves, as I look to make this pass and the defender moves, well, actually, there's another affordance for me to dribble. So as that defender closes that door, another one opens. So I'm going to go through that door there. So skilled intentionality is recognizing that affordances are nested and embedded. So that as you accept one, others might open up. Or as one closes down, others might open up. And the skilled intentionality is being attuned to all the relevant affordances simultaneously and recognizing the nestedness. So I would characterize the play that I saw in Sweden of the young kids getting the ball and driving straight for goal as one-dimensional and unskilled intentionality. Whereas some of the play you see with other players that appreciate time and space, and you see this now a lot with the videos that Mark posts, I would call that skilled intentionality because they're aware of more relevant affordances and, in fact, and the fact that they're nested and they're opening and they're changing. And the example that I give in my thesis is a moment of Andres Iniesta receiving the ball and looking to pass the ball out wide to Neymar. So it's a couple of years ago. And as he pulls his leg back, Modric steps across to cut the pass off. Now, in that moment, Iniesta just modifies his move and starts to dribble centrally. So Modric closed that door, another one opens. And as he dribbles centrally, a door opens to play straight through to Messi, so which he accepts and plays him in, and he's one-on-one with the goalkeeper. So that's how I've taken the ideas of skilled intentionality and apply them to football. But what the skilled intentionality framework does is it recognizes that those interactions and those doors opening and closing are as much about the form of life and the wider cultural practices and the social practices that people engage in, and therefore the values as well. It's as much about that as it is just what's happening on the pitch and like, you know, the zoomed in, I'm on a specific training session now.
And the thing for me, just taking it back into the training session, because I think it's a useful place to explore these ideas from the perspectives of the people listening, is skillful performance, which I think can be categorized as skilled intentionality. And the great thing about this is it's so people assume that skilled intention, if you talk about the idea of skilled intentionality, it's the idea of saying, I have this intent and these are the skills needed to be able to do this intent. And it's not that as I see it. What it is saying that skilled intentionality is about being able to act in the moment depending on how the environment changes from second to second. Roughly?
Yeah, I'd say so. And then the skilled intention, or the intention, can be quite broad. In terms of Iniesta, it might be, well, I'm looking to play the ball forward here and progress up the pitch.
Yeah.
And then the how of doing that, well, the more skilled you are, then the more doors open to allow you to fulfill that intention, i.e. that's the skilled part of the intentionality. You can fulfill it in many, many different ways, and you're open to lots of different affordances or lots of different doors opening, and you realize that as one closes, others might open, or as you accept one, others might open. So, and again, it's not rational thought, it's perception action. So it's beyond it's reflective cognition, essentially. And it's based on having been exposed to the situation and the representativeness of the situation over and over and over again to the level whereby you're really recognizing patterns in the moment, and over time you've developed, you've attuned to the environment and those patterns, and you've developed skills based on, or capabilities or effectivities based on that connection.
And that's one of the reasons why the idea that decision making is something that needs to be worked on. I mean, this is the fascinating thing, going back to the point we made about compartmentalization and specialization. Traditionally, and I think it's still a pretty dominant paradigm, decision making is seen as a separate entity in the coaching context. So in a lot of cases, I think the coaching role is seen as being one of the development of technique, creating a scenario where individuals develop technique, which it is assumed can then be transferred into an environment where decisions are required, and we'll then use those techniques, but because we've got a technique now, we're able to make different decisions, which I can understand the rationale for that, and I imagine has some merit in the sense that there may be some performers who can operate in that way. Maybe. I'm not sure how effective it is. I'm not sure, and I'm not sure of anything out there in the literature that suggests how effective that is. It suggests that it works to a degree, but when you're looking at something through an ecological lens, you're seeing it in a different way. You're saying, well, that could work. The development of the technique could work, probably given a set of idealized circumstances. And I think there's an assumption that people know that there are circumstances that resurrect themselves so many times in a game that actually by preparing yourself through this technical development, you'll have an answer. People use the word the toolbox. A toolbox of techniques that you can kind of select from. It's like one of those multi-headed screwdrivers, isn't it? Chunk, we can open the door now.
Well, I have an example of that, and I wouldn't say that I'm skilled in the way that we're talking about when I play football or futsal. This is an area that I wish I'd had more of an opportunity to develop as a young player. But I stumbled across a situation whereby more often than not, I can nutmeg a player. And it's this weird, it's a situation, right? So it's a moment in the game that kind of emerges, and I recognize it, and I recognize where they are and where my body is facing, and with my capabilities, I'm like, this is probably going to happen if I make this movement. So I've obviously recognized it enough that now I can talk to you about it and I can remember it.
Yeah.
But the first couple of times that wasn't necessarily the case when I kind of discovered it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it just happened.
And it's just that it's this weird one where my back is to the line, and I'm attacking my right hand side. And I received the ball and I'm facing backwards. And I basically put my foot on top of the ball and drag it back towards me, which makes it look like I'm going to try and run down the line. So the defender steps across, and as the defender steps, I'm just able to just nudge the ball through his legs, his or her legs, depending on who I'm playing against. And that pattern I recognize now. and it doesn't always work, but it seems to be there more often than not. But yeah, like I say, it's as close as I can get to recognizing these types of feelings that we're talking about. And then I feel like the truly skilled football players with skilled intentionality are in those moments all of the time. They're kind of like, well, if I do this, I'm attuned to the defender's movements, and I think that might happen. But obviously, I'm verbalizing something that's not verbal.
Yeah. It's too slow.
It's
Which is one of the reasons why I think a kind of a more explicit cognitive approach has such limitations, because an explicit cognitive approach can only happen almost at the speed of speech. Ish. It's not like that. And I know we're not talking about an explicit cognitive approach, but a lot of methods are explicit. They're cognitively explicit in the sense of, and I've even heard phrases like metacognition used. This idea of we've got to be thinking about thinking. So actually, we want to create an environment where the athletes are really thinking about thinking, and they're really thinking about what they're thinking about. And by thinking about what they're thinking about, they'll be able to create this shared mental model is the phrase that's used, and which is just another way of saying tactics or a game plan. They'll create a game plan, and then they'll be able to explicitly execute that game plan. My answer to that is yes, except when it doesn't go wrong, except when it goes wrong, which is going to happen a lot. Moment to moment, that's going to happen a lot. Not just game to game, and not just half to half, and not just kind of period to period, but also second to second, microsecond to microsecond. And the benefit from my perspective of the skilled intentionality approach leads, in my view, towards the idea of what they call shared affordances, because skilled intentionality requires individuals an individual to become more attuned to where information can be found that might be able to help them solve problems that present themselves. And then the second bit of that is then it begins to then translate that groups of individuals who need to coordinate to be able to solve the problems need to have a shared sense of where the information could be found that might help them solve the problems. And when they begin to do that together, that's when you begin to see groups of individuals performing cohesively that seems almost magical, like it's somewhere else, it's come from somewhere.
Yeah, and it then touches on the kind of the superorganism idea in terms of like the synchronized behavior, the coordinated behavior,
like flocks of starlings.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Which together seem to form a superorganism.
Yeah, and the schools of fish in the sea. It's like the idea was initially that there was one bird or one fish who was just the alpha leader. Yeah, so no, it's based on information and constraints.
Well, it's also, but going back to what you were saying earlier on, it's about the relations between things.
Yeah, exactly.
If you see the world as an individual fish swimming, and actually I'm going to help this individual fish to swim better in a more efficient way, and then not think about what that fish needs to think about, not think about how that fish needs to operate within its superorganism. Actually, the way the fish needs to swim is determined by the other fish, not by that fish.
Yeah. The other interesting thing here is how difficult it is to talk about these things. We're limited by our language.
Yeah, sure.
Because we've from our philosophical roots and our history of thinking isn't one whereby the ideas of direct perception or having this kind of connectivity, and it's not necessarily something that it's something that, to go back to the reading glasses idea, it's something that we haven't focused on and we've missed. So now we're trying to find ways to talk about this way of being that we really haven't been able to focus on, and we've kind of left out of our knowledge of the world. Which is causes challenges when we start to use words like affordances, and things like that. But an affordance is really important because it cuts across the subjective objective dichotomy. And I know that's big words again, but it really highlights the relationship between something. I'm not sure if I actually got that quite right. I'm sure people will let me know.
But it's interesting how this operates in a lot of different ways. So when I talk about, for example, going back to the idea of riding a bike through fog, the first thing you have to understand is that there's fog, and there'll nearly always be fog. Now, the fog might be thinner or thicker, which allows you to see further or ahead or less distance ahead, but there'll always be fog because it's complex and you're never going to have the full clarity of picture. But some people, and I wonder whether this also links to a little bit of the way just some people kind of think, like, people do have a more kind of natural tendency towards, say, a more kind of like mathematical type of way of thinking. And I can understand why this would be difficult to conceive. I mean, I've always sort of, kind of gravitated towards social science and things like that, humanities, which I suppose this kind of lends itself more towards. However, when we recognize that complex adaptive systems, they're everywhere because we're talking about human beings. And there's the challenge for us all in this space is to recognize that the scenario is imperfect. But some people really struggle with that because they're saying, well, we're not starting until we have a clear view. We're not starting until not only do we know where we're going, but we also need to know what the route there is. We need to know 100% because we could go wrong and we could get lost. And getting lost is really, really difficult. Now, I don't see it as getting lost. The way I see it is, if you iterate, if you go from the process of saying, right, we're going to start here, make some small steps, keep moving, adjust, adapt, we may end up in the same destination. We may not. But we were always going to end up in that destination anyway, because the problems arise. Those problems would have arisen anyway. What we would have done traditionally, though, is go, well, we didn't stick to the plan. We didn't stay where we were. We've failed. It's a failure. It's not a failure, because that problem would have arisen. We just didn't foresee it. So in a different way, what we're saying is we've arrived at the destination we were going to arrive at anyway, given the set of circumstances that presented themselves.
The interesting bit there is when you hit that problem, your funding gets cut.
Exactly.
In today's world, because you haven't accounted for it. And not being able to have the deliverables or the KPIs or exactly, having everything perfectly mapped out. So that's tricky. There's a lot of the stuff we've been talking about is in and around the work of Dave Snowden and the Cynefin framework and recognizing different systems. Yeah. And the guys in that space also talk about the Polynesian pathfinders or wayfinders.
Yeah, the wayfinders, yeah.
Yeah. You've heard about
Have you been watching Moana? My kids love the Disney film Moana. They talk about wayfinders a lot. It's quite good.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Have you heard about it in relation to complexity science?
I haven't. No. I've only heard it in Moana.
Yeah, only in Moana. Okay. Well, so they talked about kind of having a mark on the horizon as being the point that they wanted to get to. So if you imagine you've got a page in front of you, you can draw A to B and a direct line between the two. And that's essentially how we've wanted to view the world and suggest that, we know exactly what that line is. Whereas the wayfinders, it's more like your point A is where you start, but point B is actually an arc, which represents like the horizon. And that's the direction that you're aiming to get to. It's like, and as we talked about before, it's an intention. So it's not a fixed goal or a procedure with A, B, C, D. It's an intention is to move in this direction. And then what you do is, rather than being fixated on the A, B, C, D in the process, you then pay attention to where you are and you attune to the environment around you. and then that intention is still there, but you can be really present with what's going on in terms of the changing winds, the changing currents, and all this kind of this nuance and complexity. And the reason this is relevant is because people started to go, well, how the hell did these people populate these chains of islands whereby they couldn't, you can't see where you're going? Yeah. So working in that way is a good example of navigating complexity.
Yeah, it's a really good example, because that's the other point. The point being is, in order to guard against getting lost and genuinely going massively off track, one of the things that you must do is be extremely attuned to the steps you're taking, the journey. And you must be very mindful. Hence what you're talking about with AIK. What you've got is a critical friend with a set of tools that helps you to basically to kind of stay mindful and present about the decisions that are being made, because often the decisions are made by the knower, the person who knows something, on the basis that they think they know, but in reality they don't. And also, you've got to stay mindful of the unintended consequences. So something happens and you think, blimey, yes, didn't see that one coming. What are we going to do about that? Now, a lot of people see that as being a bit of a failure, like, oh, you should have seen this coming. You should have foreseen it, like we all could. Oh, well, if you'd planned properly, you would have seen this coming. I mean, really?
And then that's back to the idea of wicked problems and recognizing that there is no one solution. So you have to just let that idea go. Which is a difficult one for people.
There is a chance also, though, that I'm just really bad at planning, and so I'm using this entire piece of theoretical understanding to justify the fact that I'm rubbish at planning.
Well, if you're an n equals 1 and I'm my own n equals 1, well, I'm the complete opposite. I was extremely good planning, like to the point whereby I had Excel spreadsheets coming out of my ears when I was younger, and every hour of every day accounted for. And that was great, but it wasn't really living. So I've definitely moved away from that, and my pendulum might have swung too far in the other direction now as well.
Well, I definitely feel my pendulum has swung in a very much in the other direction, and I think it will stay there. I think though what I'm happier to do now is to allow the pendulum to swing a little bit more. Yeah. It'll probably never go fully back, but it'll swing a little bit more. Now, on that subject, we promised before we started, and I'm conscious of your time, even though we're an hour and 40 into this conversation, so it may end up being a two-parter. You wanted to talk to me about the rule of 3. Now, I'm not going to even profess to be the world expert on the rule of 3. I think I'm probably a brown belt if Mark Bennett is a black belt. Maybe slightly better than that. But anyway, what was it you wanted to know about it? And let's just explore that idea, because it's actually quite relevant, I think, to the conversation. It'll connect with the conversation we were having a moment ago.
Well, exactly. I think it's certainly relevant to where we started with the idea of being more player-centered, or as Mark likes to call it, player environment-centered, and the idea of promoting some sense of autonomy. So I'm interested in your experiences with it, because what I do see is it provides structure, and therefore probably helps players get on the same page. But then in some ways as well, there's one of my considerations is it too much structure at a time? And I'm just wondering about your experiences of working with it.
Well, that's something that, funnily enough, I have been reflecting on quite a lot of late, which is there a tendency for it to, again, go back to the conversation we had at the start about the power? Is it false power? Is it about a false choice? Is it saying, what is it you want to do here? And okay, well, we're going to do that as long as we, Now, so one of the things that attracts me to it is it feels to me like it sort of nests somewhere in the idea of self-determination theory, because often the challenge you have with a group is, and particularly in the recreational space that I operate in, you have 25, 20%, 30% of the young players who are there because they really want to get better and they really want to improve and they're really driven to get, to learn something. You have probably another 30 to 40% that are ambivalent and kind of there for a little bit of fun, kind of there to sort of improve a bit, but let's not make it too serious, because to be honest, I just this is one of my one of the recreational things that I do, and I get very little opportunity to have free play and space and this, that, and the other. And then you've got this other group that either are there because their parents have told them they've got to be there and they've taken them there, or they're there because they just want to be with their mates, and they want to be with another group of friends, and it's a social outlet. And the sport kind of gets in the way of it a bit, but they'll go along with the sport bit because it helps them to be with their mates. Yeah. And really what they want to do is spend time chatting and connecting and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. And so how in God's name do you as a coach sort of like try and service all of those, right? Well, obvious way is split them up and deal with each group differently. Not always feasible, particularly if there's you and there's 15 of them, and you're the only coach, right? So now you've got to find a different form of differentiation. Okay, do we put them into different groups? Well, probably not, because in that ambivalent group, there might be somebody who may become, in time, really motivated. Likewise, the ones who are really motivated might benefit from some of their friends being in the ambivalent group, and the social constructs are really important. Very complex and dynamic scenario. So one of the things that attracts me to it is to say, well, what can we agree on collectively that would allow all of us to have a good time together? Now, I think in the past I came at this from the perspective of coercion, which was get them agree to behave in a certain way so that I don't get problems. and I think there is a bit of that, a little bit. But it's really just to say, here you go, group of athletes. We've all come together to have an experience. What do you want that experience to look and feel like? And
what is it? Because like you said, it's different. We've come together to have an experience. Well, let's get that out on the table so we're clear with what that is.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And also, you tell me what you want that experience to look and feel like. Just feed into me some words. Now, I'm often doing this, kind of before, as a session starts or before a session starts, and it's done. I want it to be done really quite quickly, because I'm not going to spend lengthy periods of time with a whiteboard. I do see coaches with whiteboards at the sides of pitches, and I'm just like, what? But I get it. There's a value to that, and you could do it in a more coherent and thought through way, particularly if you've got time with players and maybe it's a wet whatever. You could do that if you wanted to, but I tend to try and do it as quickly and concisely as I can so that we can get on with the doing. So the way I do it is there's two parts to the rule of three, and in actual fact they're two separate bits that lock together, and I think they need to be done together. And I don't actually apply the rule of three quite as well as I probably could. And it's a constant challenge for me because I get into the coaching. And if Mark comes to mentor me, it's the thing he nearly always says. You're so into the coaching, you've forgotten about the rule of three and you're not monitoring that. And I'm saying, I can't do both. I've got two choices and I'm better at that one than that one. So unfortunately, that's the one that trades off. I almost need somebody else with me to be the rule of three monitor. But anyway, that's by the by. So all I do is this framing at the start, framing the experience. Tell me what you want this experience. Now, usually the way I frame it is by framing from the negative, because it seems to me that I often find it's easier for people to frame the negative, and then you can infer what the experience looks like by it being the opposite of the negative. Strangely, like what would a terrible experience be like? What would you hate? What would be an unacceptable session for you? Oh, we wouldn't be listening. I often ask them to begin with. By the way, I often ask them what they'd like me to be like. What would be unacceptable? What would you hate me to do? What would you like me to do? Right? And we can infer the positive from that. So if this is a terrible experience, like we wouldn't be listening, we wouldn't be focused, we wouldn't have intensity, we wouldn't be trying hard, and and I have to be mindful that usually it's probably the more committed ones that are the ones that come up with the words. So sometimes we can leave the others behind. So I have to be mindful, and when I'm asking this, I have to ask everybody, or I have to at the very least try and get a decent cross section, so not allow the first person to shout out, what do you think, Oscar? What do you think, David? What do you think, Jenny? Whatever. Ask them different questions so that I'm getting some different viewpoints, and then sort of meld it together and say, right, so an unacceptable session, unacceptable activity from your perspective in terms of you guys would look like that. Yes. Okay. So do I assume then that if it looked like this, this, and this, the opposite of, then that'd be good for you? Yes. And then what even more than that? So this is what Mark calls the UAEs, the unacceptable, acceptable, exceptional. What would be beyond that for you? Even better than that? And I said, look, it's totally okay to be acceptable. That's exactly, we just never want to go up unacceptable, do we? Totally okay to be acceptable because you want it to be like that, and I have to help you keep it like that. That's my job here sometimes, is to remind you when you're moving out of the acceptable zone, potentially. But we're going to maybe strive for that exceptional space as much as we can be. And maybe one way of us measuring this session, maybe one way of us measuring the success of this session for you and for me, and measuring the success of the game we might play on the weekend, might be what we report back as how often we were in the exceptional space. Purely behaviorally. And it tends to focus more on the behavioral side, the ingredients that lead to the session, not the technical aspects. And so that's the framing, if you like. So that's the framing, and I'm doing it relatively quickly, like you say. I actually now use some physical metaphors as well. Sometimes I've created a circle, and okay, this is our circle. This is our circle of kind of exceptionalism, or whatever you want to call it, and I say when we come out of the circle is when we go into our world of exceptional, acceptable play, and we never come back into unacceptable. If anybody feels that we're drifting into unacceptable, they need to step back in the circle, which is a signal that someone feels we're unacceptable, rather than them vocalizing it, because sometimes they don't vocalize it. They're not comfortable vocalizing it. It's too direct. But stepping into the circle seems to be an action. Or stepping off the pitch. I use the pitch sometimes, and I say, we'll go over this line. Once we together all step over this line, we're all agreeing to step over into a world of acceptable. If we're unacceptable, we're going to go back over the line, and we're coming off the pitch, because this is the space where we've decided we want to have this. And if we're not going to do that, we need to come back off. Yeah. So it's about, I'm trying to create this like physical metaphor for where we need to be in terms of our engagement, and always trying as much as I can to keep it around this idea of them. And so that's where the rule of three comes in. The rule of three is really about them recognizing moments when they have moved away from their stated intention. Now that's really difficult, right? They just don't do that to begin with. So often, the idea behind rule of three is they recognize, they state, they start to peer connect. And my view, and then I step in when that hasn't happened. Now, Mark sometimes advocates like doing like a countdown to say, I've seen something, you haven't seen it yet. Have you? And I'm going to give you a countdown to give you an opportunity to recognize it. I've never done that yet, if I'm honest. I've never quite ever seen that. Now I'm seeing small flickers, and I've seen it in other groups, but this particular group of workers, I see small flickers where somebody will just, hey guys, come on, let's get in. Guys, do this. We said we'd be focused. I see those, so that's good. But again, it's usually that kind of motivated 20, if you like, 20%. Go on.
Have you, so you with the same group? Is it like a prolonged period? Because it sounded like...
In this context, it is. I'm with the same group, yeah.
Okay. So there is the opportunity to build with it over time.
Yes. And I advocate that. Don't try and smash it all in one go and think that's done. You'll have to come back to it.
But do each session, do you then start with a similar conversation, or do you bring what you agreed on in previous sessions forward?
So it depends. So sometimes it can be, we've started with just one thing, and then we might build on it week to week until maybe we've got never usually more than 3, but maybe 3, 4, something like that, until we're built up. Or it could be we've smashed all 3, in which case it's a reminder. And I'll start it with a little, sorry, go on.
what would be an example of one of the things?
Intensity.
Okay.
So we're going to, often it's something like we want to have intensity. I did it with a group. I did it like a guest session for a group of recreational but semi-recreational, I suppose. They're it's like a second team, so they're knocking on the first team, but so some of them are there striving, some of them are just wanting to play recreationally. But we started and I said, what would a good session start like? And they said focus, intensity, enjoyment. They said fun. And I just said, well, can we unpack fun? What would it mean? Working hard, trying hard, doing our best. Okay, well, that's fun then. So that's what we know what that means. Okay, we're going to stay there. They were amazing. To be fair, I said afterwards, I hadn't worked with them before for a long time. In fact, I hadn't worked with most of them before. And afterwards, I just said, girls, it's one of the best sessions I've done for ages. I really enjoyed working with you. They really bought in just straight away. And that's an adult group, so I think it's easier. I've got the group I'm talking about at the moment is a group of 14-year-old boys who think they're a little bit special. Some of them do anyway. In the best way, you know what I mean, in the best way, but they're at that stage where they're starting to explore, it's all about dynamics with each other. Often they're very interested in how cool they can be. And sometimes, kind of being a bit roguish is cool. It's a way of being cool. So I'm trying to sort of say to them, I don't mind all that as long as we've all agreed to that. But you guys said you were going to be really focused and you're going to be listening in at what's going on so that you can get the most out of the hour and a half we've got together. And a couple of you aren't there.
Well, this is super interesting, right? Because then it's like, but it's like, but coach, it's not cool to listen to you. So and it's the tension then between like a wider, for them, what will feel like a sociocultural constraint to look cool in front of their mates, because they've got the social status on the line. But then in the micro, there's this other constraint, which is around, no, but we agreed to do these things. Yeah. So then you have that tension between these different layers and levels. And there's a nice paper out there that illustrates this with like a little bit like Bronfenbrenner's Russian dolls, but more like it's more like shells. So there's like the circles move out diagonally and backwards and out. You might have seen it. It's on the nestedness, on the nestedness and relatedness of constraints. Right. And it's basically just recognizing that at that inner circle you've got perception of affordances. Then as you come out, you've got attention and intention. Then as you come out, you've got strategy. Then as you come out, you've got motivation. Then you've got values, and then you can have culture and things like that. And the idea that all these different levels are then having an influence on the perception of affordances. Which again, it is nice, and then links into the ideas of the Skilled Intentionality Framework, which again I think resonates so nicely because it's also about social practices. So when you said like this is kids coming together to either strive or just to be together socially, with the Skilled Intentionality Framework, it recognizes that all the different social practices that we engage in will give meaning to our environment and then afford different options in the environment. And we can use those then they may translate into a particular practice. So, are you still there, Stu?
Yeah.
So the obvious example, which I always go back to, is Brazil and capoeira and samba being practices that kind of lead to that. Sorry, did you catch the phone call that I was getting there?
Yeah, it's fine. No problem. I just, you're busy, obviously.
You can probably edit that bit out because I don't think it's super relevant what I'm saying anyway.
Let's carry on. It's fine. No, it's good. What I was going to say though is I think you're right in the sense of so I've been reflecting on it and thinking again, so is this just another form of coercion? And I suppose in some respects it is, but it's kind of an also explicit one because it's basically saying, look, I want you to have a good time. I really do want you to have a really good time. But the problem is, if you come into this, we're a little tribe, and in order for our tribe to work, in order for our tribe to thrive, we need to kind of agree, kind of what the rules of the tribe are a little bit. Otherwise, we're not a tribe. We're just a group of kind of hunters who are all doing our own thing. And the chances are that, we won't necessarily come up with, tonight's meal, if you like. So we're agreeing to, I'm trying to just create a kind of framework, a loose-ish framework through which they agree that they're going to allow their community to operate within, and try to encourage them, and this is very difficult with teenage boy dynamics particularly, try to encourage them to be the regulators of those tribal norms that they've established for themselves, and try and take myself out of being the regulator of those tribal norms until such point where they are no longer being the regulator, in which case then I have to step in. And so being the village elder, if you like, almost. But the interesting thing about that as well is I've also tried a few different approaches of late in order to encourage. So, for example, I'd say sometimes, well, what happens if I have to intervene? Oh, punishment. We have to do laps, or we have to do, I don't know why they always jump to that, but the assumption is. And I say, well, not necessarily. I said, we can come up with a range of different ways of reminding ourselves. We can step into the zone or whatever. But one I used of late, which was quite interesting, was I said, my job is to, your job is to do this, right? And if you stay in the space and I don't ever have to remind you of that you've become unacceptable, and stepped out of your own tribal rules. I wasn't using these language, by the way, but you could use it. Stepped out the rules. If I have to remind you, less than 3 times, I will do whatever punishment you decide. And within 20 seconds, they'd already transgressed. Because one kid, literally, we were just about to get going, and we were just talking about something, and one kid just got the ball and started fiddling about with it. I'm like, Joel, thank you very much. That's 1 life. And they get 3 lives, right? So that's 1 life. Thank you very much. You're going to save me a whole load of exercise. I need the exercise, but you're going to save it me. And by the end of it, I wasn't doing any running. Because they just now I could have been a bit mean and probably found times, so it made me a little bit more tuned into it than I probably otherwise would have been. But it was quite an interesting, different way of framing it to say, you guys don't get punished. I get punished, but only if you don't kind of stick within your own rules. And it was just, I was trying to frame it differently, and it seemed to have quite an interesting effect.
Yeah. I mean, it would, it's funny because you would want them to be striving towards it, as opposed to trying to avoid, like there's avoidance motivation versus striving towards, whatever it is.
Well, you're right, and actually, I think I chose that because it was the early stage, and I also wanted them to get used to the idea that it's not about them getting punished. To a certain extent, it's a bit of a reward, not to contravene, right? But I'd had such challenging behavioural problems up to that point, and such a kind of quite a disjointed, and some kids come in saying, "Oh, I'm really not enjoying this because these kids just aren't listening," and stuff like that. You've got that responsibility to, the ones that really want to kind of commit and all that, and you're going to try and bring everybody with you. So I'd heard all that stuff, so I thought, well, I've got to at least establish this kind of base benchmark. And I think you're right, and I'm going to move beyond it to the point of now saying, right now, actually, how often can we be in the exceptional space? And if we can stay in the exceptional space, then we get whatever we get. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's like the difference between playing a rondos, whereby you go into the middle if you make a mistake, and like how that influences how you perceive defending, as like, well, defending is a punishment for not being good at attacking. Well, everyone's going to be defending for a certain amount of time, and actually, if you win the ball and dribble out the square or break a pass, you get some points.
Yeah,
and they're going to get some points if they play between you. So then there's value on both.
Yeah. I do a lot of stuff like that now in terms of kind of framing a lot of the activity from a defending perspective, on the basis that I know I'm going to get some interesting attacking responses, the whole constraint to afford idea. But also it's really interesting because it actually completely changes the mindset around what defending is.
And this comes back to what we're trying to talk about now is shaping intentions.
Yeah.
So kind of almost full circle with everything we've talked about now. Exactly. It changes the mindset around defending, and then it shapes the intention of the group, and the intention being of the attackers and the defenders.
Yeah.
So it does have a big influence on where you place the value in terms of a point system or a rule system, or how we change roles. It does shape that player environment system that they're working in. So I think it's super important, and an area that would be really interesting to dive into in terms of coaching, because then you could also look at it in terms of those wider bubbles with strategy and values and motivation, right the way into attention and attention.
But I think just circling back to this concept of, I've actually, through the conversation with you, so thank you for supporting my moment of reflection. I've actually become, I think I'm much more comfortable with the idea of actually its use. I don't think it is coercive. It is coercive, but it's coercive from the perspective of providing a safe environment for everybody to thrive within.
Yeah. So which is constrained to afford again.
Exactly. In fact, that's I don't know why I hadn't thought of it like that. It is constrained to afford. We're going to create some constraints in order for all of us to have a different kind of experience, so we can afford this experience. Perfect way of looking at it. Don't know why I haven't thought of that myself. Perfect.
Well, I really appreciate you stepping me through that, because we're partway through a process at the club which is talking about our gym space, which is a shared space between different teams and different age groups. And I'd like us to get to a point whereby it is, the players, the users of the gym, are able to kind of keep each other in line about the way they would like the gym to be. So we've just started to have that conversation. And then I think the rule of three then would be a nice way to talk about, well, how do we talk to each other about when the gym is in an unacceptable condition, and what is acceptable and what would be really excellent.
The bit that I haven't quite got good at yet is the bit of getting people to be able to feel comfortable to engage their peers in a discussion about unacceptable, and get the person who's on the receiving end of that observation to take it on in a really positive way. Sorry, not positive way, in a way that is framed around this is about us wanting our environment to stay, our tribe to be a great tribe. And I haven't quite got there yet, and they're still a bit uncertain about it, because I haven't yet built some of the tribal trust, if you like, and the behavioural norms. That'll come. So I haven't forced it. I'm going to allow it to emerge.
Yeah. That's also an area that, circling back round to Stephen Rolnick's visit, that's an area whereby some of his group facilitation stuff and the idea of a restorative approach at some level is really useful as well.
I'm really interested, by the way, in MI, motivational interviewing, and I'm working with we do a lot of work with the medical world, and there's a fantastic guy, Dr. Tim Anstis, who I've been meaning to get on the podcast for ages, but we're going to do a workshop together either later this year or early in the new year around the whole idea of the applications of motivational interviewing in sport, because I think it's got loads of resonance. And I think the way you work and the way I like to think I work, I think has a lot of its roots in some of the motivational interviewing ideas, but there's loads of other bits that I haven't yet got to.
Well, I mean, Stephen's actually written a book which is coming out later in the year.
Yeah, I've heard about it. Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm happy to connect you two as well.
That'd be great. Yeah, I'd love to have a conversation with him as well. Brilliant. James, I've thoroughly enjoyed that conversation. all 2 hours and 7 minutes of it. Can you believe that? I'm really glad that the work's going well. Really glad that the stuff at AIK is going well. I'm definitely going to want to check in again and have some further conversations. What if people want to find out more about your work? So I know you've got something, like you said, you've just got something published out at the moment. Is there an easy way for them to hunt that down?
Yeah, if they go onto Twitter.
Yeah.
So it's just at Jimmy Vaughan. That's spelt like Jimi Hendrix, because when I joined Twitter, I thought that was cool. As I've got older, I do have second thoughts about that. And I've shared it with everyone, so it's out there.
You can't change your handle anymore, can you? Yeah, I agree with you.
And I actually haven't tried, but
no, you can, but you don't want to, do you? Because everybody knows what your handle is. So
that's very true. Very true. But
anyway,
I just wanted to thank you as well, because I think the time passes so quickly because the conversation converged on a little flow experience as well.
Indeed. Yeah.
To bring back to that idea. So it has been very enjoyable. The only way I know that time has gone past so quickly is that I really need to pee.
Well, I'm not going to get in the way of that. So I've got to go and watch my little boy play in a school rugby match. So likewise, I have a pressing time constraint. So appreciate your time and look forward to chatting again in the future.
Brilliant. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the Talent Equation podcast. If you like the show, then please consider supporting it by leaving a review on your favorite podcast player, telling your friends about it, or even becoming a hero and show your appreciation by becoming a patron. Just head over to thetalentequation.co.uk and click on the Becoming a Patron button at the top of the page.